Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 240, Shelby's Raid. In our last episode, we talked about the Iron Brigade and their service in its entirety. Sort of fittingly, we turned from one Iron Brigade in the last episode to another Iron Brigade in this episode. This, of course, is a Confederate Iron Brigade and one that serves in a theater that is often overlooked. This week, we will cover Shelby's Iron Brigade and talk about their raid that we missed in the main narrative in 1863. Before we get into that, though, let's talk about some Patreon content. And of course, we have an episode posted as of this recording. We have a couple of different options here. We've done a couple of movie and series reviews recently. We just did the Apple TV series Manhunt, and we talked about that series. It was the first series that we have done, so a little bit different than the movies. And we actually did something a little bit different here for this month. We did a reading of an account from Appomattox and paired it with some pictures from a visit that I had had to Appomattox from a couple years back. So they're not necessarily from this day and age right now, but from a project when I was still in school back in the day. So a little bit of a different take. I know that's something that we haven't done yet before, to kind of put those two things together. But hopefully maybe you found that to be interesting. We've done other different types of episodes, whether that was our general drafts, our statistical analysis. We did other movie reviews, memoir reviews. We have a couple of those that are still on tap for us. A couple of movies we still actually have not done yet. And so we have a couple of those on the pike as well that are coming down toward us. So stay tuned. If any of that sounds like it would be of interest to you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now, the important question when we do these episodes we may have missed in the narrative is exactly why were they missed? For the most part, it usually gets overlooked by larger events. This is not an excuse, but rather it's important to look at the event and really understand why. And we'll actually go ahead and in our sub-episode here, we'll actually go through a list of these different types of events that we actually had to go back and do, or maybe in the narrative we kind of circled back on. And I just wanted to put together a short list and kind of talk about them, talk through them, and maybe give some reasons why maybe this is more kind of how the sausage is made, more so to kind of give an idea of why we skipped those or had to kind of come back here post-narrative and do them. Well, in the case of Shelby's raid, I think there is a slightly different reason. For many cavalry raids, there is a real visible outcome. Look at Jeb Stuart in 1862 with his first ride around McClellan. In that ride, he finds out that the Union Army's flank is in the air. So even though the raid itself accomplishes, you could argue, very little, he does have some material gain, he does have this very valuable piece of intelligence that he brings to the table for Robert E. Lee, and that actually sparks the 7 Days battles. Benjamin Grierson's raid rips up some infrastructure and keeps the rebel gaze on him rather than Grant's planned landing sites across the Mississippi. Forrest and Van Dorn have combined raids that actually use up supplies and completely disrupt the first attempts at Vicksburg. The raid itself is impressive, but there is also a result at the end of it. We talk about the miles traveled and the damages that are incurred by them or the supplies captured. Sure, but for the most part, there is a strategic importance to the action. It's a little harsh to say for Jo Shelby and his raid in 1863, but there's not really a whole lot gained in terms of a strategic advantage. It is an impressive raid by one of the war's more famous cavalry leaders. However, there is really not a whole lot to show for it. In many times, the raids are able to draw troops or otherwise attention away from certain fronts. Indeed, this was the intention of the John Hunt Morgan raid, or even early in his attempt on Washington. In some cases, limited as they were, there would be a buildup of troops to protect supply lines or otherwise deal with these probes. With Shelby, the goal was to take away the attention and put it on Missouri. Missouri, once again, as we have previously gone over, is a state that is often on the wish list for Confederates, especially from the cave state, in the form of Sterling Price. But the fascination always somehow comes up short. Well, Jo has the same kind of idea that Price has a year later. If there is action in Missouri, then maybe there will be a diversion of Union troops from elsewhere. If we can recall, in the summer of 1863, things are not going well for the Confederacy as a whole. July, especially, spells the beginning of the end for the Confederate States of America, with Gettysburg, Tullahoma, and Vicksburg all happening. You can even stack in Helena, Arkansas, as well as Honey Springs into that equation, and we have even more setbacks to deal with if you are the South. So, in many ways, it's kind of already a done deal, and Missouri is kind of overshadowed by these bigger events. Also working against them is that Missouri is already kind of a problem area with the Lawrence raid and then continued guerrilla activity. So yes, more troops heading there is going to be a little more far-fetched. So there is a lot of factors that go against Shelby when he launches his raid to the overall strategic success. But this does not mean that he will not pull off one of the more impressive raids of the war. It is spectacular enough that we should regret missing it in the main narrative, and now give it our full attention for this episode. I think a brief refresher on what's been going on in this theater of the war is necessary. In our narrative episodes, remember, in the early days, we spent quite a lot of time in Missouri. Part of this is that we were already there in terms of conflict prior to the firing on Fort Sumter, in the form of Bleeding Kansas, which of course is pitting the pro-slavery border ruffians against the Kansas Jayhawkers. This would be over the question of Kansas and whether it would be a free state or a slave state. Obviously, this goes back to the question of kind of popular sovereignty and whether these states are going to have a say in the decision of whether they will be pro-slavery or not, whether they will have the decision of making that on their own. And remember, and we will talk about this actually in a future episode, we kind of circle back and we will revisit kind of the beginning of the war. I've talked about how we will have that episode here. It's on the schedule. But really, the conflict is over not so much the states that already have slavery, but more so it's about the continued spread of slavery. That's why when we read off Abraham Lincoln's speech, he's not really talking about how he can necessarily make slavery illegal in places like, say, Alabama and Mississippi. He's saying that I can't really touch that, but the fear is that we're going to continue to be outnumbered as these states because we're going to start to try to eliminate the ability to continue in this territory as we continue west as a country. So that's part of really the conflict as we get into the middle of the 1800s, right? Jo Shelby was a rich planter and heavily involved in the pro-slavery faction of this conflict. When war broke out, he also witnessed the Camp Jackson affair, an early action of violence in the Civil War. In these early days, we have Sterling Price and his Missouri State Guard, joined by some Confederate troops. Shelby would see action at Carthage, and then again at Wilson's Creek. Already, he had some sort of experience when it came to raiding from Bleeding Kansas, and hit-and-run tactics especially. This is actually very similar to Nathan Bedford Forrest and his gaining of experience prior to the outbreak of hostilities that's going to lead him to be an effective cavalry leader. Shelby would continue to bounce around in Arkansas, participating in the Battle of Prairie Grove, Helena, and then 2 Marmaduke raids, which failed for a variety of reasons. For one, he attacked a fixed position at Springfield, and then for another, his column was weighted down by a larger baggage train. Almost trapped against a river, a bridge was built for escape, but not before a large amount of his troops would desert. Jo Shelby had been in the thick of the fighting with his Iron Brigade, being wounded but also gaining additional experience in how to conduct raids into Missouri. And a raid into Missouri at this point of the war would seem to be a good idea. At this point, Little Rock had fallen to Frederick Steele in September of 1863. This would be after the failed attempt by Theophilus Holmes to capture Helena that would see Shelby wounded in the fighting. This battle, of course, occurred on July 4th, 1863, which, as we mentioned, added to the overall disaster that had befallen the Confederacy in that first week of July. Like with most late war action in the Cave State, the goals for Jo Shelby were going to be plain enough. Keep the war in Missouri alive and away from Arkansas, divert troops and resources, and maybe get additional recruits that could join the South. All of this made sense, and for Shelby, he would do it with a lean, agile force that could be sufficient for this hit-and-run tactic. Thomas Reynolds, the governor in exile from Missouri, would give his okay for Shelby. I have an account of the beginning of the raid. On the 10th of September 1863, Little Rock had been evacuated, and a few days later taken in possession by the Federals. This was a great blow to the men of the Confederacy. Fort Smith also had fallen, and these 2 towns on the Arkansas River gave control to the Federals of one half of the state. Through the White and Arkansas rivers, it opened up means for transporting men and supplies 400 miles south of St. Louis. To Arkansas, the loss of the Arkansas River was what the loss of the Mississippi River was to the Confederacy. It was yet, however, a great task for the Federals to move supplies from the White River or the Mississippi River when the stages of the Arkansas River prevented the passage of boats along its waters. The loss of Little Rock and Fort Smith and the shutting off of the Confederate troops from easy access to Missouri had done much to depress the spirits of men who, west of the Mississippi, were struggling for Southern independence. So remember, too, we talk about how in kind of this back half of the war, there are certain states that are going to see their morale plummet because they're going to be essentially lose, their territory, right? Whether that's Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, certainly you're going to see a lot of desertions. Arkansas is going to be no different than that, right? And that's also going to be a reason why you can reasonably ask the question, right, where Kirby Smith, and you think of what you want of him, where he's kind of sort of living on his own island, and certainly you can be critical of him for not wanting to relinquish command in certain situations, but there is kind of this thought process of, well, why don't you send troops where they're actually needed, and not many of them are going to want to go, right? He needs to keep these men here in a position. Morale is super low, so he's doing his best just to keep them together. For months, Shelby had entertained the idea that if he were to but turn loose with 1,000 men, he could ride to the banks of the Missouri River, do much damage to the property of the Federals, and bring out a large number of recruits. In Missouri, the conditions had rendered it unsafe for men who sympathized with the South to express their sentiments, and anxious again to turn his face towards his adopted home and meet his friends and family, and longing for glory, which he felt would come to the successful prosecution of such an expedition, he pleaded with Generals Holmes and Price and Governor Reynolds and the other officials in the Trans-Mississippi to give him permission. The Confederate authorities looked at the thing more calmly than the young military enthusiast. He assured them that the recruits would be abundant, and that he could fill up his ranks, dismay his enemies, and inflict severe loss in every way upon his foes. They felt that he was taking a tremendous risk to make such an expedition. Some suggested that he was hot-headed, that he lacked the experience, as well as the poise for so grave an undertaking. He had been a colonel for 22 months. None could deny that he was courageous, that he had faith in himself, that he was possessed of unlimited enthusiasm. These were a splendid equipment for the work he essayed to do. Shelby's persistence at last prevailed, and on September 10th, 1863, consent was given for him to make the attempt to carry out his plans. He was allowed 800 men, 12 ammunition wagons, and 2 pieces of artillery. Only 600 of his men started with him from Arkadelphia. 200 recruits he was to pick up later further north. Arkadelphia, in Clark County, Arkansas, was 115 miles south of Ozark, at which point Shelby had determined to cross the Arkansas River. From Fort Smith, as well as from Little Rock, scouting parties had gone 60 miles south of Ozark, so that in 50 miles from where Shelby started, it was certain he would meet opposition, and that the Federals would attempt to thwart his plans. Once permission was given, there was nothing short of death that could stop Shelby's march. He had pleaded to go, and no dangers, no opposition could deter him from his purpose. It was true that gloom and doubt had settled in the hearts and minds of many of the leaders who at that time were gathered in and about Arkadelphia. But this spirit, either of hesitation or fear, never touched the soul of Shelby. The people who permitted Shelby to go had forebodings of the outcome, and permission was only granted when it became apparent that nothing would satisfy Shelby but an opportunity to work out his plans. The limited number of soldiers allowed him showed that the Confederate leaders were not willing to risk very much on his undertaking. Marmaduke, always ready to take risks, assented, but he gravely doubted the result. The men who were to go with Shelby were as enthusiastic as he was. It was homegoing. It was an opportunity to try out chances with the militia over in Missouri, whom Shelby and his men hated with greatest bitterness. The autumn sun was shining brightly when Shelby aligned his small force, placed himself at their head, and waved adieu to Governor Reynolds. The other troops, watching the departure of these gallant and dashing raiders, experienced deepest sorrow when they realized that they were to be left behind. There was no man amongst the thousands who witnessed the going of these brave boys who would not have willingly taken chances with them. There were no fears of what the future would bring forth. 1 man in every 6 of those who rode away would not come back, when at the end of 36 days Shelby would return. 200 men taken, each from 4 regiments, lacked in some respects homogeneity, but all shouted and waved their hats and guns as the command marched past down the line. From that moment they became brothers with a common purpose and common courage. The fact of going had, by some subtle telepathy, which always marked cavalrymen, gone out among the entire brigade, and from that moment there was universal eagerness to ride with Shelby, and when the assignments were made and the columns formed, there were 2,000 disappointed men who felt most keenly the dealings of fate which deprived them of a place in the moving column. If the selection had been made, left to Shelby, he would most likely have taken his entire regiment. These had become with him so dependable, and between themselves and Shelby there had grown up not only affection, but complete trust. They believed in him, and he believed in them, and they felt no emergency could arise, and that he would make no call upon them that was not demanded by duty. As these 600 brave men mounted into their saddles, and the column started cheer after cheer, greeted each company as it passed. Governor Reynolds and General Price forgot the formality of military etiquette, and with those who went and those who stayed, they joined in the vociferous cheers. Benedictions came from every heart, as out into the unknown dangers and experiences of the expedition these men rode, souls all aglow with patriotism, joy, and soldierly valor. When Shelby held the hand of Governor Reynolds, the expatriate governor prayed him to be cautious, begged him to save as far as possible the lives of the young heroes under him, and to be watchful even unto death. As this kindly admonition ended, the governor pulled the leader close to him and whispered into his ear, "Joe, if you get through safely, this will bring you a brigadier general's commission." So, as this account suggests, it would be only some 750 picked men for Shelby's ride. He would have Major Benjamin Elliott and his scouts, the most elite of his troops, with him leading the way. Also accompanying him would be the recruiters and 2 pieces of artillery, a 6 and a 10-pounder. His troopers were going to be wearing mostly captured Union uniforms, which is going to assist in the raid. In fact, Elliott scouts wore a full Union uniform and even flew an American flag to deceive the enemy. This would be a common tactic of guerrillas, and the questionable discipline sometimes the Iron Brigade is described with would add more to that than, say, the scouts dressed as Confederates in similar Union raids. A variety of weapons added to their firepower, many armed with rifled muskets as well as revolvers. This was so the force could fight mounted or dismounted if necessary. Facing them would be tough terrain and large numbers of federal troops. Steel, as mentioned, was at Little Rock. The northern part of the state was sparse when it came to people or supply. John Schofield was in St. Louis with more men and the provisional enrolled militia. Remember that the Missouri militia was sometimes pro-Confederate, many being forced to join, but the provisional enrolled militia would be men who were more sure to fight. Once in the state, there would be no targets, Shelby hoping to cause as much havoc in the central part as possible. So if you remember the account that we just read here that talks about the beginning of the raid, Shelby's command especially, they are going to be targeting this enrolled militia more so than the regular militia, right? Because those are going to be the individuals who are going to be anti-guerrilla, anti-Confederate, more so. And much like we see in other places, there are going to be certain units, certain regiments that are going to be your kind of anti-personnel, whether it's Kentucky, and there are a couple of regiments that we see in that state that are going to be, and Tennessee as well, East Tennessee regiments that you see in that state. And there are going to be some that are going to be more heavy-handed when it comes to dealing with the populace. There are going to be a couple of Missouri regiments that are going to be the same here. So obviously there are going to be those who, even if they are not guerrillas, right, these are more regular army troopers, they're certainly going to have ties to, still your family there. Maybe you have ties to guerrillas. Those are maybe relatives, maybe, all right? So you're not going to necessarily have a soft spot in your heart for these individuals any less or than your guerrilla probably does. The raid would officially begin on September 21st, Shelby setting out with his command through Arkansas. To illustrate the kind of Wild West vibe of the state, the first action the raiders would see would be ambushing a band of outlaws. It is unclear the motives of these individuals, whether they were Union partisans, deserters, or just simply looking to profit off the people in a time of war. Moving through Bentonville, Shelby would find little in terms of resistance. Initially, he would use misinformation in his raid to keep the Federals on the back heel. As such, he was able to get into Missouri and begin the real raiding proper. Joined by several bands of recruits and possibly even guerrillas, his men would set up on Neosho, Stockton, and Greenfield in quick succession. They would overpower small garrisons and capture much in terms of supplies. Around this time, Quantrill and his raiders would be launching their own operations, possibly in support of the raid. This would result in their attack on Fort Blair and their Baxter Springs massacre. The fort was attacked, but Lieutenant Pond would fire an artillery piece, although he did not know how to use it, the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry being there to garrison. They would deter the raiders from their continued attacks. Quantrill's band would then attack James Blunt and his party, killing many members of the band traveling by wagon. Blunt would barely escape from the incident, running away from the carnage. Quantrill would reportedly exclaim, thinking he had killed the Federal general, that Shelby or Marmaduke could not whip him, but he could. We talked about the Baxter Springs massacre in our main narrative episodes, but also skipped Shelby and his raid, so the context of providing some kind of support, or maybe just seizing the opportunity, is also important. Shelby and his Iron Brigade had made it to Warsaw, capturing more supplies there. Warsaw is on the Osage River, and is in the vicinity of Boonville and Jefferson City. Boonville, of course, is a pro-Confederate town that was a key base of operations for Price in the early part of the war. Remember, that is also, Price and the State Guard and Claiborne Fox Jackson, right? We had that as part of our kind of main theater in the early 1861 days, all the way back there in the main narrative series. Schofield and the rest of the Federals were beginning to converge on the rebels, in the meantime, the threat of their raid being truly felt. Fort Scott was a muster point for available troops in the area. They would begin to converge on the Confederates, but the communication would be poor, and lack of coordination would hurt the pursuers. Major Reeves Lazier of the 9th Missouri State Militia would be the primary catalyst in harassing Shelby, even as his men were still in Boonville. This was a detachment of Odin Guitar's command, a unit who was particularly known for combating guerrillas within Missouri. As such, they would skirmish with the Iron Brigade as they made it out of town. In fact, they would get the surprise on the rebel camp as they prepared for the day. But fortunately for Shelby, this was something that was more of a probe, and not the full weight of an attack. The Confederates able to form into line and dissuade the enemy. Shelby would then make his way to the Lamine River and attempt an ambush there on October 12th, dismounting part of his force. While casualties were light, it would temporarily keep the Union troops at bay. Shelby would continue, Lazier joined by Egbert Brown and additional Federal troops. Brown had previously been the defender of Springfield during Marmaduke's ill-advised attempt on the town. The rebels would again make a stand on the same day at Merrill's Crossing of Salt Fork Creek, engaging in an artillery duel with the attacking Union troops. From here, Brown would make the decision to send Lazier around the Southerners, making for the town of Marshall. If he was able to drive the enemy, then he would have a trap set up for them. On October 13th, Shelby would engage Lazier, turning his force to attempt to break this trap. Facing them would be a little over 1,000 or so men, so not an insignificant number. Shelby would lead Major David Shanks back to the creek with 200 men while he probed Lazier. The defenders were assisted in the fact that the battlefield was covered in brush, and they were able to utilize a stone wall. The main Confederates would attack the Federals, but Lazier would hold the line. Shanks, meanwhile, would do a good job in delaying Brown, who eventually had to send forces around the flank to get the rebels out of their position. Having done so, Shanks would conduct a fighting retreat. Shelby was dividing his command in an attempt to remove them from the field, when G.W. Kelly and 200 or so men from the 4th Missouri State Militia would charge, breaking the already dividing rebels into two. Moving away from the field, the Federals would pursue the enemy with some skirmishing, but both sides would see few numbers in casualties. Indeed, it is not known exactly how many losses there were at this rare fixed battle of the raid. Numbers for these smaller engagements differ widely. Shelby's divided command would continue to be harassed by Federals. Ewing would attempt to cut off the raiders before they made it back into Arkansas, but with some hard riding and a little luck, with poor weather deterring their hunters, the Confederates would make good on their escape, arriving back in Washington, Arkansas on November 3rd. But what exactly should be made of Shelby's raid? Well, for one, it should be said that this raid produced a more positive results than Marmaduke's raids, which were not without their bright points. Now, you could also be saying to yourself that, kind of in my description of the raid, that it kind of sort of ends, right? That is kind of anticlimactic how it kind of ends for Shelby and his raiders, and you could be correct in that kind of thought, right? But then again, if you kind of think back to these Marmaduke raids, there's always kind of where the other shoe drops, right? The Confederates ride into Missouri in these, especially these two main raids that Marmaduke launches, and something happens and there's some sort of setback and they have to get chased back into Arkansas, or there's some kind of escape that has to happen, right? So something goes wrong and Shelby does see some setback, but something does not go as wrong as these Marmaduke raids, right? So you could say that it's a win in that regard. A goal would be to divert any troops which might have been used in other theaters of the war, specifically for William Stark Rosecrans as he approached and then moved beyond Chattanooga. Troops could not be shifted that otherwise might have helped him post-Chickamauga, although I will point out that it was not really too difficult to get Grant and Sherman over there fairly quickly, especially given the situation of Braxton and Bragg content to siege as opposed to any kind of offensive action. In terms of material gained, the success of the raid is really difficult to determine. Not a whole lot of supplies were captured. The light traveling Iron Brigade was living off captured stores mostly, so there would be not as much in terms of a boon of supply. Shelby was forced to abandon his artillery and wagons in this quick escape. Additionally, it is questionable if there was a net gain in troops in his ranks. Those recruited might have deserted, or even veterans might have went home. While there was not a large fixed battle, there was enough in terms of skirmishes that might have depleted his ranks. Still, Shelby would see his star rise, gaining a promotion and his return to Missouri fairly soon, especially in Price's Great Raid into the state in 1864. So overall, you can actually say that it is questionable as to how many objectives were really accomplished. And that, I think, lies as to why we actually had this skipped over in the narrative. It's not really a disaster, but it's also not really a great success either. Now, you could also argue as well in that, while it's neither of those two things, as we mentioned, that Shelby is very heavily involved, right, as we get into Price's raid into 1864, right? And this is definitely maybe inspiration for that, and maybe it is valuable experience for that raid into 1864. We can definitely maybe chalk those two things up, and certainly you can make an argument about that, and you certainly could make a springboard off of that. But I think that's kind of stretching things just a little bit. You know, Shelby might have been able to perform just as well, and the raid would have gone just as it did in 1864 without this raid. You know, you're still going to have essentially the same personnel as you did, right? It's not like Kirby Smith is going to change his mind about who he sends into that raid in 1864. It's not necessarily like Price is going to change his mind about raiding in 1864, and it's sort of like a desperation move in many ways, and it's not like Westport's going to not happen had this raid happened or not, right? So, you know, I know that's a little bit harsh to say, and certainly everything would have been different, right? But it is something to maybe think about. But I will leave you at this. This is kind of a little bit of a negative, right? There was a little bit of a ragging on the raid itself and talking about that in that sense. I'll leave you with this, and this is the positive. And this is what I came up with as we kind of went through the episode and the recording and whatnot. And I will say this in terms of the kind of the pantheon of these episodes and doing this raid. And I will say this, and this is the positive, in that we get to go back to Missouri, and I will say that, and that's just for us, right? It's forget Shelby, forget Odin Guitar, and all those other guys, right, that were involved with the raid, and this is just for us. That's just the Civil War Weekly crew here, right? We get to go back to Missouri. We get to talk about Carthage and Boonville. We had Claiborne Fox Jackson, right? We talked about him. When's the last time we mentioned his name, right? And we got to talk about, Wilson's Creek, Prairie Grove. It's been a long time since we've been in this area, and it was definitely something that we talked about in the very early stages of the main narrative. It was really, certainly, it makes sense, and we talked about it at the top of the episode. It was already kind of a battleground before the war. We were already kind of had the knives sharpened, so to speak. So it was really easy to start cutting. It was already kind of ready to the fuse was lit. So ready for the explosion of the conflict to really begin. And so we had a lot of action that began fairly quickly in 1861, even before we got into First Manassas. So it was a long time since we were in that area, and to even have some mentions and to kind of revisit this area and kind of even kind of have this little jog on the treadmill. I know we didn't really dive into it, but even have this kind of little jog through our memory lane treadmill here, I think is worthwhile, right? So Shelby's raid here, and that will be our positive note that we can close out on here. So let's go ahead and stop there for today. We have gone back and righted the wrong of not covering Shelby and his raid into Missouri. A little late, but better late than never. Next episode, we will take on two controversial figures in a little bit of a different type of episode. Next time, we will discuss Ambrose Burnside and John Pope. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.